When I first found the letters, I thought they were just old papers. Yellowed pages tucked inside a wooden box, wrapped in a ribbon that had long lost its color. But as I unfolded the first one and read the name on top, "My dearest Lila," I realized they weren't meant for me at all. They were love letters. And the handwriting, it wasn't my father's. That moment, standing in my mother's old bedroom, sunlight filtering through the curtains, was the day everything I knew about my family began to change. I remember I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, holding the papers, my fingers trembling. The ink had faded with time, but the words still carried warmth. Every line sounded like a whisper from another life. One my mother had lived long before I was born. I always believed my parents' marriage was built on quiet love. They weren't the type to hold hands or say "I love you" out loud. But there was a peace between them, the kind that comes with time. Or at least, that's what I thought. Back then, I never questioned why my mother sometimes looked distant when old songs played on the radio. Or why she kept that one locked drawer in her dressing table. Every family has secrets, I told myself. Ours just happened to live in silence. Scene Q, soft crackling of fireplace, gentle humming in background. I grew up in a small coastal town, where everyone knew everyone. Our house sat on the edge of a hill, overlooking the sea. My father worked at the port, and my mother, Lila, ran a small flower shop near the market square. To the world, she was gentle, polite, and always composed. But to me, she was everything, the center of my small world. She loved white lilies. Said they were a symbol of peace, of forgiveness. I never understood why that word, forgiveness, seemed to mean so much to her. When I was young, she'd hum while arranging flowers. Always the same tune, soft and wistful. I used to think it was just a song from her childhood. But later, She didn't speak right away. For a long time, we just sat there at the kitchen table. The steam from her tea rising between us like a veil. Her hands were clasped together, trembling slightly. Then, in a voice softer than I'd ever heard, she said, "His name was Edward." The name lingered in the air. Simple. Gentle. But it carried weight, the kind of weight that can silence a whole room. "I met him before your father," she continued. I was 19. He worked at the post office then. He used to bring flowers to my shop, saying they reminded him of me. I listened, frozen, trying to hold on to the image of my mother I had always known. The quiet, gentle woman who loved lilies and never raised her voice. But as she spoke, I realized there was another version of her. A young girl who once believed in impossible love. Scene Q, flashback imagery, seaside town, laughter, warm light. She told me about summer evenings spent walking along the pier. How they'd talk for hours, sharing dreams about the future. She wanted to open her own flower shop. He wanted to travel, to see the world. They were both poor, but rich in hope. He used to tell me, she said, smiling faintly. "One day, Lila, I'll send you a letter from every city I visit." But life, as it always does, had other plans. Her father, my grandfather, didn't approve. He thought Edward was too restless, too ambitious. He wanted her to marry someone stable, someone respectable. And so, slowly, the visits stopped. The letters became shorter, then stopped coming altogether. "I thought I'd forgotten him," she whispered. "But some loves, they don't fade. They wait." Scene Q, present day, quiet house, ticking clock. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask her why. Why she never told me, why she married my father while her heart still belonged to someone else. But the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, listening, as if afraid that asking might break her completely. She looked down, her eyes clouded with something I couldn't name. "When I met your father," she said, "I was trying to move on. He was kind, patient. He loved me in his own way, and I tried. I truly tried to love him the same." My throat tightened. "Did you?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. I grew too, she said. But part of me was always elsewhere. The confession felt like a crack across the air. A truth too painful and too human at once. Scene Q, soft rain outside, tension rising. For days after that, I couldn't look at her the same way. Every time she spoke, I heard the echo of that name, Edward. I found myself going through the letters again at night, reading every line as though it could answer the questions my heart refused to ask. They weren't all written before she married my father. Some were dated years later. Even after I was born. The words were tender, longing. But they spoke of distance, not betrayal. He wrote about hearing she'd married, about seeing her from afar one winter morning. Standing outside her shop, holding flowers he couldn't bring himself to give her. You looked happy, one letter read. And that's all I ever wanted for you. I promise, this will be my last letter. But it wasn't. There were 4 more after that. Scene Q, daughter narrating in reflective tone, slow pacing. I began to question everything. Had my father known? Did he ever read these letters too? Was their quiet marriage a kind of truce between truth and pretense? I found myself angry, though I didn't want to be. Not at her, exactly. But at the idea that love could be divided, hidden away like those letters. One evening, I confronted her. Did Dad know about Edward? I asked. She looked at me, startled, and then sighed. Yes, she said softly. He knew. I froze. He knew? She nodded. Your father found out a year after we married. He never said much, just asked me if I'd ever see Edward again. I told him no. And I meant it. Her. It happened a month later. Life had started to return to a kind of quiet normal. Mom spent most of her days in the garden again, planting new flowers, humming softly as she worked. She still looked frail, but there was a calm about her. As if she had finally stopped running from her memories. One afternoon, while I was sorting through some old boxes in the living room, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. We didn't get many visitors anymore. When I peeked through the window, I saw an older man step out. He wore a gray coat, a cap pulled low over his brow. There was something familiar in the way he moved. Slowly, thoughtfully, like he carried both time and memory on his shoulders. I didn't recognize him. But when my mother came to the door, she did. Scene Q, door creaks open, quiet breath. She froze when she saw him. For a second, I thought she might faint. Lila, he said softly. His voice, old, trembling, but kind, carried a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Her hands began to shake. Edward. The air between them filled with something heavy. Not the excitement of reunion, but the ache of everything left unsaid. He took off his cap, holding it nervously. I heard about Thomas, he said, my father. I'm sorry. Her eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. Thank you, she whispered. I stood in the hallway, frozen in place. The man from the letters, the ghost of my mother's past, was standing right there in our doorway. Scene Q, inside the house, soft ticking clock, long pauses. They sat in the living room while I hovered nearby, pretending to tidy up. The room felt smaller than ever, filled with quiet tension. Edward looked older, but his eyes were still bright. He spoke gently, carefully, as if afraid his words might break her. I moved back here last year, he said. My wife passed a while ago. I didn't plan to come. When I walked past the market and saw your shop, I had to see you one last time. My MOT. Life had started to return to a kind of quiet normal. Mom spent most of her days in the garden again, planting new flowers, humming softly as she worked. She still looked frail, but there was a calm about her. As if she had finally stopped running from her memories. One afternoon, while I was sorting through some old boxes in the living room, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. We didn't get many visitors anymore. When I peeked through the window, I saw an older man step out. He wore a gray coat, a cap pulled low over his brow. There was something familiar in the way he moved. Slowly, thoughtfully, like he carried both time and memory on his shoulders. I didn't recognize him. But when my mother came to the door, she did. Scene Q, door creaks open, quiet breath. She froze when she saw him. For a second, I thought she might faint. "Lila," he said softly. His voice, old, trembling, but kind, carried a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Her hands began to shake. "Edward." The air between them filled with something heavy. Not the excitement of reunion, but the ache of everything left unsaid. He took off his cap, holding it nervously. "I heard about Thomas," he said, "my father." "I'm sorry." Her eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. I stood in the hallway, frozen in place. The man from the letters, the ghost of my mother's past, was standing right there in our doorway. Scene Q, inside the house, soft ticking clock, long pauses. They sat in the living room while I hovered nearby, pretending to tidy up. The room felt smaller than ever, filled with quiet tension. Edward looked older, but his eyes were still bright. He spoke gently, carefully, as if afraid his words might break her. "I moved back here last year," he said. "My wife passed a while ago. I didn't plan to come. When I walked past the market and saw your shop, I had to see you one last time." My mother didn't speak for a while. She just stared at her hands. Finally, she said, "I thought you'd forgotten me." He smiled faintly. "I tried. Believe me, I tried." Something in her face softened, a mixture of sadness and peace. It wasn't romantic, not anymore. It was two souls quietly recognizing the part of themselves they'd lost. Scene Q, daughter's internal narration, slow reflective tone. Watching them was strange. I had spent weeks angry at the idea of this man. This shadow that had lived in my mother's heart. But seeing him there, fragile and human, I couldn't hate him. He wasn't the villain of our story. He was just a chapter that never got to end properly. When he finally noticed me standing by the doorway, he smiled gently. "You must be her daughter," he said. I nodded, unsure what to say. He looked at me with eyes full of warmth and quiet regret. "She looks just like you, Lila," he said softly. My mother smiled, a real smile this time. The kind I hadn't seen since my father passed. Scene Q, afternoon light fades, the three sit together quietly. They talked for hours. Not about love or what could have been, but about the years that passed. About people they once knew. The places that had changed. The simple fact that they were still here. When Edward finally stood to leave, he took her hand and held it gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting me see you again." My mother blinked back tears. "Thank you for remembering," she said. Scene Q, door closes softly. Silence. After he left, we sat in silence for a long time. I could tell she was somewhere else. Half in the present, half in the past. Finally, she spoke. "I thought seeing him would hurt," she said. But it didn't. It just felt complete. I nodded, still processing everything. "Do you regret it, Mom? Keeping it from us?" She thought for a long moment. Then she said, "No. Because it taught me something about love. That sometimes, loving someone means letting them go. And sometimes, it means staying even when your heart feels elsewhere." Her words stayed with me. They didn't make the story simpler, but they made it real. Scene Q, evening, soft light through window, gentle piano underscore. That night, I went through my father's old desk. Inside one of the drawers, I found a small envelope addressed to my mother. It was sealed, yellowed with age. For a long moment, I hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside was a short note, my father's handwriting. Lila. I know about Edward. I know your heart still holds a piece of that time. I'm not angry. I just hope you find peace in the life we built. I love you, not for who you were, but for who you became with me. Always. Thomas. Tears filled my eyes. My father had known. He had lived beside her secret, quietly, gracefully. Without resentment, only understanding. And in that moment, I realized something I had never seen before. That love isn't about possession. It's about compassion. About knowing someone's heart might be bigger than you imagined. And loving them anyway. Scene Q, rain returns, gentle rhythm against windows. Later that night, I found my mother sitting by the window, watching the rain. I gave her the letter. She read it slowly, silently, her lips trembling as she finished. Then she smiled through tears. He always knew, she whispered. Yes, I said softly. He did. She closed her eyes, holding the letter to her chest. And for the first time, I saw peace settle over her. A peace that comes only when truth no longer needs to hide. Scene Q, emotional crescendo, warm strings, slow fade out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about them. My mother, my father, and the man she once loved. Their lives had crossed and tangled in ways I could never fully understand. But in the end, they had all chosen love in their own quiet ways. I used to think my family fell apart the day her secret came out. But now, I see it differently. Maybe we didn't fall apart. Maybe we just fell open. And learned what love truly means. A week passed before we heard the news. Edward had fallen ill. The postmaster's wife called my mother to tell her he'd been taken to the small hospice near the church, the same one where my father had once volunteered. I saw the way my mother's hands tightened around the phone. She didn't speak, only nodded, her eyes suddenly far away. When she hung up, she stood by the window for a long time, silent. Then she turned to me and said quietly, I need to see him. Scene Q, road sounds, soft wind. The two drive in silence. We didn't speak much during the drive. The road curved along the cliffs, the sea glinting pale gray under the morning light. Every turn felt heavy with memory. I kept glancing at her, her fingers resting in her lap, her expression calm but unreadable. For a moment, she looked almost like the girl she once described, 19, full of hope. When we reached the hospice, the nurse recognized her immediately. He's been asking if anyone named Lila might come, she said gently. I saw my mother close her eyes and take a slow breath. Thank you, she whispered. Scene Q, dim hospital room. Slow clock ticking. Edward was resting when we entered. He looked smaller somehow, fragile beneath the blanket. But when he saw her, a faint smile crossed his face. Lila, he murmured. She moved closer, sitting by his side. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out, taking his hand. You shouldn't have come, he said weakly, but there was gratitude in his eyes. I wanted to, she replied softly. I needed to say goodbye properly this time. He laughed faintly. You always did like to finish things neatly. The sound was gentle, like a sigh. Scene Q, daughter's narration, slow, reflective tone. I stood quietly by the door, watching them. It didn't feel wrong anymore, their connection, their shared history. It simply was. Two people who had loved, lost, and lived through decades apart. Now meeting again in the final calm of life. He told her he'd never remarried after his wife passed. He said he had lived a good life. But part of his heart had always stayed by the sea, where she once sold flowers on the corner of the market. My mother listened with tears in her eyes. And then, in that quiet room, she leaned closer and whispered. I never stopped wishing you peace. He smiled. I found it, he said. Right here. Scene Q, later that evening, outside the hospice. When we left, the sun was setting. A soft orange glow stretching across the water. My mother stood there for a while. The wind tugging at her shawl. The light touching her face. "Are you all right?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." She looked at the horizon, her eyes glistening. "You know, for years I thought love was something that bound you forever. To one person, one promise, one choice. But now I see, love changes form. It never leaves, it just finds new ways to live in us." Her words were quiet, but they sank deep into me. Scene Q, passing days, montage feel. The sound of the ocean, wind through trees. Edward passed away a few days later. My mother didn't cry when she heard. She just sat very still, holding one of the lilies from her garden. She placed it in a small glass jar on the windowsill. Then she whispered, "Rest now, old friend." There was no grand farewell, no drama. Just peace, soft and dignified. It felt right. Scene Q, morning light through kitchen window. Peaceful atmosphere. Over the next few weeks, the house felt lighter somehow. We talked more, about the past, about my father, about forgiveness. My mother seemed to grow gentler with herself. One morning, as she made tea, she said quietly, "I think your father would have liked him." I looked up, surprised. "You do?" She smiled faintly. "Thomas had a big heart. He understood things most people couldn't. He might have even thanked Edward for loving me when I didn't know how to love myself." Her words brought tears to my eyes. That kind of grace, I had never known it could exist between such tangled lives. Scene Q, daughter's inner reflection, slow pacing, gentle piano. Sometimes, I still go through those letters. Not to reopen wounds, but to remind myself that love, even unfulfilled, can shape who we become. I understand my mother now in a way I never did before. Her quietness, her moments of faraway thought. They weren't emptiness. They were memory. And my father, with his silent acceptance, taught me the kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud. Together, they lived a story both fragile and brave. Scene Q, evening, soft rain, daughter sitting beside her mother. One evening, we sat together watching the rain. She reached for my hand and said, "Promise me something." "What is it?" "When you love someone," she said, "love them honestly. Don't let fear or guilt make you hide parts of yourself. The truth hurts, but silence, it hurts longer." I nodded. "I promise." She smiled and leaned her head on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, "for trying to understand me." Scene Q, months pass, narration slow, peaceful. Seasons changed. The flower shop became mine to manage. Sometimes customers would tell me, "Your mother has the gentlest touch with lilies." And I'd smile and say, "She always believed they meant forgiveness." Every morning, I still find her humming that same melody while watering the plants. The sound feels different now, lighter. Like the sigh of a burden finally released. Scene Q, dusk. Daughter walks along the pier alone. I often walk the pier these days. The same one she once described from her youth. The wind smells of salt and memories. I imagine her and Edward there, two young souls laughing against the sea breeze. Then I think of my father, steady, patient, building the life that carried us forward. I realize now that love isn't a straight line. It's a circle. And somehow, we all meet again at the center. Forgiven, understood, whole. Scene Q, night settles, piano swells. My mother keeps the letters still. Not hidden anymore. They sit in a small box on the shelf beside my father's photographs. Sometimes she dusts them gently and says, "They're part of our story too." And she's right. Because families aren't built only on truth or perfection. They're built on the courage to face both. Scene Q, soft closing tone, piano and ocean breeze fade together. I used to think the day her secret came out was the day our family fell apart. But now I understand. It was the day we finally learned what love truly is. Something that bends, forgives, and finds its way home even after years of silence. It's been 10 years since that day. The day my mother's secret came out. Sometimes I still think about how easily a single truth can change everything. But now, when I remember it, I don't feel the same ache I once did. What used to feel like betrayal now feels like revelation. A door we finally opened after keeping it shut for too long. Scene Q, morning in the flower shop. Gentle bustle. The flower shop is quieter these days. My mother doesn't work as much anymore. Her hands tremble sometimes. But she still insists on arranging the lilies herself. She says they remind her of all the people she's loved. Those who stayed. And those who had to leave. I've watched her grow older with a kind of peace I never thought she'd have. And maybe that's what forgiveness does. It doesn't erase the past. It softens it. Turns it into something you can live beside. Scene Q, daughter's voice softens, remembering. A few months ago, we visited my father's grave. My mother placed 2 lilies there. One for him. And one for Edward. I asked her why. She smiled and said, because both of them taught me love in their own way. One showed me how it begins. The other taught me how it endures. That stayed with me. Scene Q, warm sunlight through the window. After we left the cemetery, we stopped by the pier. The sea was calm that day. She stood by the railing, the wind in her gray hair. And whispered. I used to think the sea took everything from me. But now I see, it just held it all until I was ready to remember. I didn't say anything. I just held her hand. Sometimes silence says everything words can't. Scene Q, later that evening, home setting. Teacups, low light. That night, while making tea, she asked me. Do you ever wonder what your life might have been? If I had chosen differently? I thought for a moment and said. No. Because if you had, I wouldn't be me. She smiled, her eyes misty. I suppose that's true. Every choice carries someone forward. Then she looked at me, really looked. And said. I used to hide my past because I thought it made me weak. But now I see it made me human. I just wish I'd trusted love enough to tell the truth sooner. I reached for her hand. It's never too late to tell the truth, I said. Especially when it brings peace. Scene Q, narration fades to reflection, quiet piano, ticking clock. After she went to bed, I sat alone for a long while. The letters were still on the shelf. Faded now, edges curling. But somehow alive. I opened one, the very first one Edward had written her. The handwriting was shaky but warm. He had written. Love doesn't always ask to be chosen. Sometimes it just asks to be remembered kindly. I closed the letter and felt a strange calm settle over me. Because that's what my mother had done. Remembered kindly. And maybe that's what all of us are meant to do in the end. To look back at the people we've loved. The mistakes we've made. And choose kindness over regret. Scene Q, final moments, waves return, soft closing tone. When people ask me about my mother now, I tell them she's the kind of woman who taught me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. That it's okay to have a past. It's okay to have regrets. What matters is how gently you carry them. Because life isn't about never breaking. It's about learning how to hold your pieces. And still keep walking. Scene Q, final piano swell, warm and slow. The day her secret came out. Our family did fall apart for a while. But in that quiet wreckage, we found something stronger. Honesty, forgiveness. And a love that no longer needed hiding. And sometimes, late at night, When I hear her humming in her sleep, I think, maybe that's how love sounds. When it finally rests.